Okay, so I think we are um, now at a point where we are ready to start. So once again, we apologize for the technical glitches. I'm not really sure what happened there. Something in our feed to YouTube was not working properly. It's always worked properly on all of the prior board meetings, but we have no visual presentations tonight, so no one will miss out on any information. So with that, again, our apologies, but we're going to get started now, and I'm going to turn it over to our moderator, Nancy Gordon. So thank you very much.
Hi, good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Nancy Gordon, and I'm an 18-year resident of Edgemont. All three of my boys have been schooled in the district, and I currently have a freshman and a senior at Edgemont High School, as well as a sophomore in college. For the past 6 years, I've served on the board of our Edgemont School Foundation, where I'm currently the chair, and we have a very close relationship with Victoria and the board as it relates to the district and how we can help with supplemental fundraising for areas that the school budget does not cover. What we wanted to do today was pull together a fairly tight agenda. So we are going to start out with what is the current situation with the board vote, so everybody's clear on why this vote is so important. We're going to talk about what is the budget today and how that was developed. We're going to talk about what the ramifications are if the budget is not approved and the contingency budget goes into effect. And then we'll also talk about what modifications can be made to the budget after it's approved. I thank everybody in advance for all the questions that were submitted. We had over 30 questions submitted in advance, and our goal is to answer and address all those questions during this call today. With that said, I'm going to turn it over to Alex.
Okay, thank you, Nancy. So first thing I'm going to do is just give a quick summary of sort of how we got to this point and what this point is. So we have a normal process for developing a budget, which spreads out over a fairly large period of time. We started back on February 25th. The administration presented the first round of the budget to the board. March 4th, we had a budget workshop. March 10th, we had board meeting continued discussions about the budget. And first of all of these are public meetings, and they've all been accessible and streamed on YouTube successfully, ironically. On March 24th, as we were recognizing the effects on the community and from a financial perspective, the budget, even though it was a fairly lean budget, we asked the administration to go back and present some potential cuts to us because we recognized what the community was dealing with from a financial perspective. On March 31st, they came back to us with some cuts. We'd asked them to, any cut was going to have an effect. We tried to make them stay as far away as possible from direct effect on students and the quality of the education. On April 21st, we then discussed that budget. It had over $630,000 of cuts from the originally proposed budget. On May 5th, we adopted that budget. That budget has a 2.99% tax levy increase, which I'll talk about in a minute, but some just important points to know about the current situation right now. The current budget, people have asked, it cannot be changed. Once it was adopted and put out to the public, it can't be changed. I mean, in fact, at this point, we have, I think, almost 800 people that have already voted on it. So by law, we can't touch it. The only way it changes is if the budget is voted down. But if the budget is voted down while under normal circumstances, we would have a second bite at the apple. We would have a chance to present an amended budget to the public, that because of the current restrictions this year and because of the fact that all votes are only by absentee ballot, the timelines involved in terms of state mandated steps that you have to take, hearings that you have to take, notices that you have to put out to the public, and all those things that have to happen before we could then get a new budget printed and mailed out to the public. Basically, every school district in the state has come to the same conclusion that there would be no possibility of presenting and having time to have a vote on a second budget. So basically, this is our one shot. If this budget does not pass, what happens is we are forced to adopt what is called a contingency budget. Some people refer to it as an austerity budget. We'll talk again in more detail about what that means, but at a high level, it means in addition to the $630,000 that we have already cut from the original proposed budget, we have to cut more than $1.2 million additional out of the budget that you have seen proposed. So that's where we are now. So now I'm going to, I believe, Nancy, did you want me to talk?
Yeah, thank
about,
you.
About what's in this budget and why it is where it is?
Yeah, so if I could just recap what I heard you say. The budget that's out in the district right now is getting voted yes or no. If
Correct.
it gets voted no, it is automatically reduced to a set number, and neither of those numbers could be changed. That just happens automatically.
That is correct.
Okay, great. And so maybe you can spend some time talking about what is the current budget and how it was developed.
Sure. Okay, so the current budget is proposed at $63,677,000, which represents a change of about $2.3 million from last year. And as I mentioned, the number that I think most people focus on, it represents a 2.99% increase in the tax levy. So basically, assuming if your house has not changed value, your property taxes would go up by 2.99%. Most of the dollars in our budget generally are areas that we can't change. So, I mean, if you want me to back up, there are all sorts of, items. We do a sort of a bottom-up budget. We look at what we've spent, in the current year. We look at what changes we think are necessary. We look at things that we'd like to add for, furthering and bettering the Edgemont education that everyone came here for. We look at changes that we're forced to make because of changes in regulations or whatever. And we also try and balance that while being fiscally responsible, because we're responsible to all members of the Edgemont community, whether you have students or not. And we go through, or the administration goes through a bunch of iterations trying to get that down to as tight a budget as they can before they submit it to us. We felt this year that it was a fairly lean budget, but as we mentioned, we then asked for cuts after that. So we've got this 2.99% tax levy increase. If you look at what makes the reasons behind that increase, the drivers that go into it, it basically boils down to primarily three categories. Personnel, which is, we'll talk a little bit that later, but that's basically a contractual obligation. All of those costs that are in there that are contractually obligated. The next major line in terms of where increases came from are special education. Special education, again, is not a area where we have any discretion. Basically, when the IEPs are put together for the students that need special education, we have to provide the services that are determined by that. We actually in the district have been pretty good over the last few years of actually driving that cost down, but sometimes things happen where we just can't create a program for a child. We get children with special needs, and this year we had some children move into the district that just had severe needs that we cannot meet ourselves. And so in those situations, we either have to send them to someplace else that can meet the needs, or in some cases, the needs are so severe that they have to be provided in home for the student. And this year, for example, we have one student that is going to cost $190,000 to provide the services just for that one student. So a big portion of the increases this year happen to be special ed. But again, these are requirements by law that we have to provide these services to the students. The next biggest area of increase is transportation. And I know we've seen a lot of questions around that this year. So I want to spend a little bit of time letting people understand why that is. This transportation is transportation that we are required by law to provide to students who go out of district for school. So this would be students whose parents have, for whatever reason, have chosen to send their school to another school. Maybe they've chosen to send them to the master's school, as an example. Because they've made that choice, we don't have to pay any tuition or anything to master's school, but we are required by law to transport to and from the school of their parents' choice. People have asked, well, that doesn't seem fair, and why do we have to do that? They made the choice to do that. They're all valid questions, but the bottom line is the law says we have to pay for that. So again, we have no discretion. So that's what's in that line. The reason for the very large increase this year in that line is because transportation has been going up for all the districts in this area. It's become very hard to get someone to provide transportation. For this next year, we did put out to bid to all of the transportation providers in the area to ask if they would, give us a bid on our service. And the only bid we got back was from our current provider at a dramatically increased price. I mean, just to give you an idea, maybe 2 or 3 years ago, we were paying $8,000 per student per year for transportation. Their bid for next year was $15,000 per student per year. And you could say that's outrageous, and I would say you're absolutely right. But again, the only way we could do it ourselves, and believe me, we looked at that, but we would have to build a garage and hire buses and hire drivers, and the cost, we are not big enough in scale to make that worthwhile for us, despite the expenses involved. So what we did manage to do is we looked around and we did find that Ardsley has a consortium of schools that have basically banded together to get some volume purchasing power, and they did allow us to join that consortium this year. So as large as this increase is, it's not as big as it was in the first budget when we were having to assume that we're going to have to pay that $15,000 per student. But it's still a large number, and it's another large percent of the increase. We had in the scheme of things, not so large increase, but an increase in our legal, audit, and insurance. Again, all things that we have to do. And our debt service, which is our payment on our bonds that are outstanding, went up a teeny amount, but I just have it included in there as one of those categories that, again, we have zero discretion. We can't default on our bonds. And actually, I had a good question just in direct conversation with someone earlier today. It's that, we're in a low interest rate environment. Could we refinance our bonds? And the answer is we actually have refinanced everything that we have outstanding, some of them multiple times, to the lowest levels we have. And some of the newer debts, you're not terms of the bond or that you can't refinance before a certain amount of time has passed. So there might be some opportunity, in the future. But some of our later bonds were actually issued at a pretty low interest rate. So whether we can or not, but in any case, that will be in the future. So if you take all of the dollars increases in those categories, put them together, they make up 99.7% of that increase. So 99.7 of that 2.99% tax levy increase all come from those categories over which we have no discretion. If you look at every other category that we have for all the other things we pay for and compare them to last year, all those other categories have an increase of $6,400 on a budget of $64 million. So they're flat. We have taken out everything we could from every place that we could find to take out without, again, cutting into the meat of the education. So that's how we ended up with presenting what we felt was again, in this environment, a fiscally responsible budget while still not causing the quality of the education to suffer. So, did I answer?
Yeah. Thank you, Alex. Yeah, I think that was a great summary. I heard 2.99% increase in the tax levy. Biggest drivers in the budget are personnel, special education, transportation. Most of the categories are mandated, so we don't have the opportunity, to change. And of the categories where there was discretion, the budget was in essence flat from prior year. So if the current budget proposal is approved, or if it's voted down and the austerity budget, goes into effect, what modifications does the district have, to make to the budget after the budget's approved?
Marquita, you're muted.
Sorry, thank you. So I think that if the current budget is voted down, right, as Alec mentioned, we move to a contingency budget to adopt by June 30th. And spending, so that basically keeps all revenue items the same except for the tax levy, which the same as the budget we've proposed, except for the tax levy, which is held at the 2019-2020 level. So again, that's a $1.2 million. Spending on that budget then is actually at the discretion of the administration. So they manage the distribution across the expense lines, but we would expect the board to be heavily involved in those decisions. The only decision that would have to be made by June 30th would actually be decisions about how many teachers are coming back in the upcoming year, because we have to give them contracts for the upcoming year by June 30th. Once we give them contracts, we cannot lay off any teachers. And so we need to really be clear about exactly how we want to lay out those $1.2 million in cuts across the different categories of cost. As I think you saw in the document that we sent out on Sunday or on Monday, when we talk about layoffs of teachers, it's a last in, first out policy, which is the last teachers that were hired are the first teachers out, and those teachers are compensated at a different level than certainly the average. They're below the average compensation level for our district. So we'd have to think about how many of those teachers we'd have to actually we'd actually have to take out of the budget. We'd also have to weigh those teacher reductions against a couple of our discretionary areas. As you heard from Alec, we don't have a lot of discretionary areas. So the two discretionary areas that have high that we could look at as other areas for cuts would be athletics and co-curriculars, and that includes the music program and debate and things like that. That's what falls into co-curriculars. I will also say the contingency budget is also subject to any changes in state aid. So it's unprecedented this year. For the first time, that the governor has stated that he may change state aid once budgets are adopted, which is, as far as I know, has never happened. So the result of that could be that at any point during the year, we'd receive some sort of updated number from a state aid standpoint, and we'd have to actually make reductions to or continue to draw down on our fund balance to address those particular changes as well. Since again, once we actually have teachers contractually obligated for the year, we cannot lay off teachers. So once the budget is adopted, we also can't change the tax levy. So once we've raised, this is the time that we ask the tax levy, and that is the full tax levy for the full academic year or fiscal year, I guess. So we cannot ask for any more tax money until next year's budgeting season. We can move money between line items as long as there's money available. Change and distribute money based on what's happening during the year. We have that discretion. So we have budgeted for an in-person program and full athletic program for next year because of all these limitations. If we didn't program for that and then we didn't budget for that and we actually ended up with that scenario, we could not find money again to support it. So we have funded that. If there are changes to the program, we are less in person, we have limited athletics, we have limited trips, we have changes to what we think we can actually do during the year, that money will either be shifted to other lines to cover other expenses. Certainly if we're distance learning, we're going to have other expenses associated with materials that we have to get to students and other things that we have to do, technology support, etc. So we will have those monies there to support that, and any savings we have from the district budget automatically go into the fund balance and then can be used in future years. So all those changes are made by the administration, and then the board as recommended by the administration, the board approves all those changes. So for instance, if in the fall we have a transportation shift where a bunch of private schools aren't open and the kids don't need to be transported, that money goes back into the budget for us or to put towards future budgets. Same thing with fall sports. That's the kind of the format that we've used for budgeting, because we do have to be prepared for the most expensive and fullest school year that we could expect to have. So that is what happens once if there's a contingency budget, and then the flexibility we have once the budget is adopted on June 30th.
Great, thank you. So it sounds like if the budget's cut by 1.2 million, the district is going to determine how many teachers would need to be cut as a result, because those decisions need to be made contractually by June 30th. You can't lay off teachers, mid-year. It's a LIFO, last in, first out. So chances are the teachers may cut across different grades. We don't know. We'll have to see how that falls, and that you're saving and the reason you go for the teachers over other areas is to have money for the discretionary areas, just in case there's more state aid changes that Cuomo passes down after the budget's approved. And the types of other discretionary areas beyond the teachers that could be cut is the athletics or the co-curricular, which includes like music, debate, and the likes.
Right. So Nancy, if I could just pop in for just to add one thing to that. So Marquita is 100% right in terms of any decision we would have to make about teacher layoffs, we do have to make by June 30th. We have not had that discussion yet in terms of, how would we distribute the cuts? So could there be a scenario that we didn't do any teacher layoffs? That could be a scenario, but just to give you an understanding of the magnitude of that $1.2 million in cuts, if we decided that was the most critical thing to protect in order to make up that money, just when you look at what there, for example, it would require getting rid of all athletics and all extracurriculars. So again, we've had no discussions yet. We're working very hard to not have to make those decisions, but that's sort of the magnitude of the decisions we have to make if we're forced to. But we have not specifically started charting out scenarios yet about what we do. Like I said, we're hoping we don't have to make that decision. If it's voted down on June 9th, then June 10th, we start that work.
Okay, got it. Thank you. Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Arakita. I'm going to turn to some of the questions that came up that may not have been covered yet as part of the backdrop that you just provided. There was a couple that came up in the administration category related to assistant principals. Greenville Sealy do not have them. Edgemont has had one. Is it excessive to have 7 principals level administrators in our district?
Yeah, so let me jump in on that. I think that we knew at some point in the last 5 years that that from a administration standpoint, the existing staff was taxed, and we had 2 choices. We could either do centralized administration and hire, a head of HR and a VP of communications, or all those types of things to take care of some of the additional administrative burden. But we made the choice to actually put more administrators in the actual buildings with the students and with the teachers, so that we had more people doing teacher observations, more people pushing into classrooms and learning the students' names and figuring out kind of what the students' needs were. So just from a perspective standpoint, in each of these buildings, we have over 60 employees, right, so with different schedules and different responsibilities. And before we had the assistant principals in the elementary schools, they overseeing their work. So it was overseeing their training, overseeing their observations. We are required by law to do a number of observations of the teachers, and to be quite honest, it's impossible to coach teachers without observations and without many observations. So those became critical decision points for us to figure out how to put more administration in the buildings. I think that they're responsible for the safety and security of over 500 students in each of those buildings. And so again, kind of training the aides, making sure that we had the right security procedures in place, making sure that the aides are aware of all the different elements of the social emotional learning capacity. These assistant principals are still getting up to speed. So this is, we're hoping in the next year, once we're back at school full time, that this is really when we're going to start to experience a lot of the benefits of having them in there from a curricular standpoint. At the high school, we actually used to have 3 assistant principals. And so, I think that, again, we're talking about 2 assistant principals, 500 students, and there the complexity is even greater, right? You're talking about scheduling issues, you're talking about guidance, you're talking about different types of disciplinary issues, et cetera. So in an average year, my guess is that we could get away with 1 assistant principal for 1 year at the high school level. And so when we were looking Brian Paul moving into this interim position, we were discussing whether or not we need to actually replace that position. But in light of the current situation and our expectations for what the fall is going to look like, it does not seem even remotely feasible that we could leave all of that up to Kyle and Jen without having significant things fall through the cracks. If you just think about it there, right, we're talking about a large number of teachers who are all making a transition to distance learning and just need much more support and oversight as part of that. So that's and relative to other districts, we actually are administratively similar. It's very hard to compare because everybody puts different things into the administration line item, but our administration is comparable, if not slimmer, than many organizations, and we have many more people kind of on the front lines with our students.
Great, thank you. Another question came in related to benchmarking. Question was around why our school district has the highest percentage of school budget increase compared to some neighboring districts such as Scarsdale.
Sure, I can take that one. First of all, again, you have to look at what numbers you're comparing. I know this came up on social media, and so there's sort of 2 sets, basically two benchmark numbers that people put out there. One is the budget to budget increase, and one is the tax levy increase. The number that they're talking about there is actually the budget to budget increase. Now, I am in no way, shape, or form saying that number is irrelevant, but I think all of us as taxpayers, the one that we actually focus on is the tax levy increase, because that's the one that changes, the dollars that you pay in your taxes, whether how much they're going up. So if you look at that, we're actually, we're probably above the median, but we are definitely not, there's some districts that are much higher than we are. Second point of that is, again, that 2.99, I've just gone through, it is what it is for reasons that we can't control. Each district is different, so I can't go into, don't have the time to go into the line items of every other district to compare, but I know I saw a couple of people say, compare it to Ardsley. They're like, oh, Ardsley's close, Ardsley's a good school system, they're similarly sized, their rate is only, 0.81 or something like that. That was their budget to budget increase. But if you look at their tax levy increase happens to be 2.66%. Is that less than 2.99? Yes, but it's not so much less. If you then drill into the specifics of their budgets that I did, just to get a feel for what it is, their special education, again, I explained the reasons why ours has gone up $500,000. Theirs is going down $13,000 next year. We talked about transportation, again, because they've had the benefit of this consortium for a while their transportation is going up roughly 17%, ours is going up about 35%. So right there, you can see just some, it's not an apples to apples comparison when you just try and look at, those high level rates. So, again, I can't speak to every district, but I think we've spoken to, why our number is what it is. So this isn't again, a situation of, well, we think 3%'s okay, and Ardsley thought they needed to get theirs down, or Scarsdale thought they needed to get theirs down to 2%. They're also, again, for a school like Scarsdale, who's something like 2.5 times the size of us, they just have more areas where they can approach that they can cut out of. Again, if you want to benchmark, one of the things I've been doing recently is before this happened, I've been trying to get a sense of, are we efficient with our tax dollars? And one measure that I think is fairly indicative of that is how much does each school district spend per student, right? To get, the quality of education, how much are they actually spending on that? We spent this year $30,000 per student on education. Scarsdale spent over $34,000 per student. So, you can look at what the effect of another $8 million added to our budget would be, which is the effect if we had that extra $4,000 per student. You can suddenly see there's probably a lot of room for them to find some cuts that we just can't because we're so lean to begin with. Greenberg 7 spends $39,000 per student. So to me, those are probably more relevant benchmarks than just, a rate that, again, is driven by, in a lot of cases, things that we have no control over.
Great. Thanks, Alex.
Mm-hmm.
A couple questions related to fundraising.
Mm-hmm.
And, how our taxes have become, more excessive, and that could be a negative factor as it relates to, to real estate. Clearly, it's a delicate balance. So the question really was around, instead of raising taxes, is there a way to have families pledge money, or donate, through a fundraising association so that the Edgemont education can be maintained?
Yes, so I'll jump in on that. I think that, the district cannot raise private funds itself. We do have several arms and several great partners for the district between ESF and the E Club and the PTSA and the PTA that really do a great job of raising money for lots of different aspects of the Edgemont experience. Two of those organizations, ESF and the E, generous pledges as part of a previous bond that we are using in our operating funds. But generally, these organizations give gifts. They don't actually give money to operating funds, and we cannot budget for their gifts that are not committed. So certainly they could raise money for something for the school, but there's not those cannot be budgeted unless they can be committed to ahead of the budget process. Again, these are really generous organizations. They actually support our district to the tunes of hundreds of thousands of dollars every year, and it's all enrichment stuff that we really depend on. But we cannot actually budget for operating funds from those entities, and we do actually have to change the budget at the end of the year to account for the money that they have given to us.
Got it. Great, thank you. There's another question around, how the budget's updated. With actuals, like, as an example, this year, if SAT proctoring, is that still a fee if exams gets canceled, and, there was overtime fees for groundkeeping while the school was closed, things related to electrical bills, transportation costs, even though a lot of programming was canceled. Do those get refunded, reallocated in the budget? What happens to shifts in actuals throughout the year?
Well, so I think looking at that specific question, someone was looking at, we put out, in some of the documents, we put out what was budgeted for a category for this current school year. We have a line that says what at that point in time, what did we think we were actually going to end up the year for in that line item, and then the proposed budget for the next year. And so someone is looking at that line and saying, for example, as you said, there's X number of dollars of SAT proctoring. We know that, a couple of the SAT were canceled, didn't happen, so we aren't paying for proctoring. Why is that number not been adjusted down? The reality is that expected number, that anticipated number for the year, is basically only used for budgeting purposes. So at the time, and it's actually a requirement by law that we put that number out there. But it's only useful when we're putting together the budget, because when we're looking at the budget, right, we can say, all right, we spent, so I'll just make up an example. We spent $1 million, we budgeted $1 million for a line item this year. Right now, our expected expenses look like we're running 900,000. It looks like we're going to end up for the year. And again, in this particular case, those numbers would have been probably in February. Or they may have been updated for the other one. But anyway, they're a point in time number before all of this COVID happened and these changes that we're seeing now occurred. So if we've had $1 million budgeted, we look like we're anticipating 900,000 this year. We can then take a look at, why is it 100,000 less? Is that something that we think is sustainable, something that's going to, be the same next year, or is it a fluke of something that happened? Some event got canceled and we didn't have to pay for it, but next year we will. That kind of thing. But it's used for budgeting purposes. Once the budget is put out, those numbers don't get updated because they really serve no purpose for us after that point, other than just they would eat up time that we don't have, but they're not used anymore. So that's the reason why you don't see those changes reflected in that anticipated number. To the other part of your question, in terms of what happens with So, we didn't take a school trip, so we didn't have to pay for the bus to send them on that trip, or certain activities didn't happen and we didn't have to pay for them. Yes, there undoubtedly will be some areas where we have saved some money. Until this school year ends, we won't really know exactly the magnitude of those savings. We also know, as Marquita spoke about, that there are going to be differences in our revenues next year that we don't know what they'll be. There'll be differences in expenses from what we budgeted, because we just, again, we have three scenarios right now for next year. As Marquita said, we have to budget for, as if the way we started out this year, everybody going to school every day, the normal that we've had for years and years. But we also have to plan for a hybrid that says, okay, students will be in class, but less time, fewer people in at the same time, and supplemented by distance learning. And we have to plan for potentially nothing but distance learning if there's some great spike in COVID again, or we learn something more. So we have to plan for all three of those scenarios. We can't have three budgets out there, and we really don't know what the changes will be if any of those scenarios occur. So we will have some savings in some areas. We don't know the magnitude, but basically they are effectively being earmarked for either expenses that we have not anticipated, or the aid cuts that could well be coming from the governor that we can't plan for because we have no idea if they're happening and what the magnitude will be. So again, if that money, if somehow magically we get significant savings and magically state aid is all funded, the federal government plugs New York State's $61 billion gap, and we get all the aid we're expecting, and we don't have unexpected things, then in that highly unlikely scenario, those dollars could be used, for example, to replenish the reserves. We're drawing down $2.3 million in reserves this year just to keep the budget at this level. So we could use some of those monies to potentially replete those reserves. But right now, we're anticipating that any savings we have will get used somewhere. So we need to, basically just hang on to them.
Got it. Thank you. Thank you, Alex. There's quite a few questions that came in related to teacher contracts. Given the current economic climate that we're in, the high unemployment rates, as an example, many companies laying off staff, furloughing staff, asking staff to take, pay cuts. Can you talk a little bit about the district's relationship with the teacher unions, and how do we negotiate with them? How do we push back as it relates, to voicing complaints about some of the policies they have potentially around, tenure requirements or LIFO? And is there any cost savings, related to, teacher salaries, given that we've moved to online instruction and may continue to have more online instruction going into next year?
So if you look at many of the contracts in Westchester, you'll see that people have not reduced and have not changed their teacher contracts. It is really challenging to change teacher contracts and do kind of near-term reductions and future makeups, given the tax cap penalties on state aid and unpredictable tax cap penalties on state aid. So we have managed the budget since Sue has been in place. We have managed the budget to limit the peaks and valleys, to adhere to the tax cap, and to give the taxpayers a predictable tax environment. We do that through kind of managing and using consistent union contracts and using reserve funds where we need to. We fund those reserve funds when we can, and then we pull from them, like for this year, to the tune of $2.3 million to really manage down the increase in the tax levy. Going over the tax cap, if we were to take money out of the teacher salary line this year and kind of double down on it next year, which we'd have to do in order to negotiate any sort of shift with the teacher, that would yield a very significant increase next year, which would absolutely result in us being over the tax cap. And that has real ramifications for state aid. And, you know, not only the state aid, but we'd also have to have 60% of the voters actually come and vote to exceed that tax cap. So it basically feels like we're kicking the can down the road to give us some relief right now, and I totally get the need for relief right now, and we would love to be able to offer more relief around that. The challenging thing is, I think the long-term ramifications create a huge spike for taxes in the coming years, and it has been our philosophy and our attempt to try to manage against those spikes so people can predict and manage the increase gradually over years. And just to be very clear, like, it is a renegotiation. When you open up the teacher's contract, you renegotiate every term in the teacher's contract. And so that's, we have asked the teachers, we've negotiated many things with the teachers this spring, and we've come to really good agreements about how to operate. We are going to have to work with them again in the fall around way that we're going to be managing the education kind of requirements given the scenario, but right now that is not on the table.
Okay, thank you. So we've got 3 more questions that we were going to cut through. So thank you for everybody's as patience, because I know this is probably running a little bit longer than most folks thought because of our technology issues. But I did want to address 3 more questions that did come in. One happened to be about technology and about the amount allocated to technology and textbooks decreases at a time where we are using technology more. Clearly the e-learning system that we're using today has had some faults, and not all technology, is working, and sometimes can be limiting. So Alex, can you talk a little bit about the school's view on technology and textbooks?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, so in general, in technology, right, we've already, yes, been trying to shift more to make better use of technology and to not use technology just for technology's sake. We have, particularly one woman in the technology staff, Andrea Nash, who works with each of the teachers to help rework their curriculum to make more efficient use of the technology, and not to have it. There's something they call a SAMR model. So the first level of technology is just substitution. So you now have a form online instead of a piece of paper. Then you have augmentation, is when you use the technology to do some additional things that you didn't do before. M is modification, where you actually start to really change the way you do things with the technology. And then R is really replacement, when you fundamentally change how you approach the technology. So we've been working along that path for a while. Some of that has been helped by the Chromebook program that we instituted a few years ago. I've been on that committee even before I was on the board, and we now have all 5th through 9th graders have their own Chromebook that they take home every year. And that was actually we obviously weren't planning for this, but that was very fortuitous this year, because in terms of when we had to send the students home, there was a whole large chunk of them that now already had their technology with them. They had their computers with them to do that. We then have supplemented for any family that didn't. We have offered, Chromebooks to anyone who needed them. We, I think, lent out somewhere between 200 and 250 additional Chromebooks to families that needed them. In a few cases where people didn't have good internet connections, we've actually given them like Verizon hotspots, mobile hotspots, so that they can get their connectivity. So, we are doing a lot of things, shifting that direction. We do make less use of textbooks. That's not a shift you can make real quickly, because sometimes the publishers don't want to make electronic versions of their textbooks available. They get more money out of the hard copy ones, but we are making those shifts. But as far as the part of the question about, if you look at the current budget and where are those dollars allocated and how's that going to work if we're shifting to different things, once the budget is passed, the only real restriction on the district is we can't spend more dollars than the taxpayers have approved. So whatever that top level number is that's on the ballot right now, that's what the taxpayers are approving, that dollars. Then the district has within that limit really total discretion. I mean, again, not total discretion, because if we're paying teacher salaries, we have to pay teacher salaries, but there is no prohibition, and we do all the time shift dollars between categories. Sometimes it's just because, right, one category we didn't need as much as we thought. In another category, we needed more than we budgeted for, because it's still an imprecise art trying to budget. So we can do that. So, but if, again, in a scenario where, right, if we're doing less of certain things and more of another, in this case, technology versus, say, textbooks, we have the ability to make those shifts. The board has to sign off on them, but there's no prohibition of making those shifts within the $63 million, let's just call it.
Got it. Great. Thank you. There was another question that came in around tuition students, specifically as it relates to Edgemont staff that may be sending their children or the dependents to the schools without paying full tuition.
Right.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Teachers do have the benefit of sending their children to Edgemont schools. That's standard for any school district anywhere. We did have a policy for a number of years where the teachers didn't pay any tuition for their students. A few years back, the board modified that policy. Existing teachers were grandfathered in. They didn't suddenly start charging for kids who had already been going tuition free, but any teachers that have come in since that time now have to pay a portion of the tuition. That's in place. As far as, though, do we have any discretion? We do. So let's take an example of, let's say, all of the fifth grade sections at both elementary schools were basically, at the numbers where we wanted to keep them and didn't want to raise them. And so adding a student would cause us to add a new section. We absolutely have the ability to say, no, we're not going to do that. So sorry, we can't take your child this year. The same thing could happen, although obviously we prefer not to if a child of a teacher is here this year. But again, maybe because of the way the section sizes went, having that student there next year meant we'd have to keep an extra section. We would have the ability to say, sorry, you can't come back next year. I'm not, again, haven't gotten anywhere near to looking at, do we have that situation yet? But yes, we do have that flexibility if needed to say, we're sorry, but no, not this year.
Got it. Okay, thank you. There's another question that came up. I guess I put it in the bond category. Pre-COVID, there was discussions around, expanding a fourth campus or facility expansions, within the 3 current campuses. The question was really around, does this year's budget take any of those plans, into account? We've seen a lot of districts in our surrounding area, Bedford, Scarsdale, to name a few, that have seen shrinkage. And so how do we know that Edgemont will continue to grow as rapidly as, as we think? And, another part to that was really around the reserves and what reserves do we have for building expansion, and thinking about the funding around, hybrid online learning. So I think, the gist of that question is, how do we think about the facilities expansion given the current climate?
Sure, I can answer that one. So all of I'll first take the part about, what in this budget takes that into account, what kind of reserves, that all those pieces of the question. Any kind of expansion, if we were to choose to do it, would come through a bond, by raising the money through a bond. A bond is always a separate standalone vote that the community gets to vote on. There's nothing in the actual budget for next year that has anything to do with expanding facilities. There's no dollars in there that we're committing to because we think we need to expand. We have So that's the first thing. This budget, again, as we've talked about, even though we can't change it if we wanted to, there's nothing. If we said, so let's just take for sake of argument, let's say we suddenly changed our view and said, you're right, we don't think enrollment's going to go up, it wouldn't have changed what we presented in this budget. So that's the first piece of it. The second piece, I guess I want to talk about, when we first started talking about the bond, I mean, we've talked about the bond for a number of years, but when we first started talking more tangibly about what kind of scenarios that might look like, I think when they're saying a fourth campus, I think we never really talked about a new campus, but we did in some of the scenarios talk about potentially some new buildings, including one scenario which would have a new totally autonomous building, which means that building would have everything it needs within the building that students would never have to leave. It'd have its own auditorium, its own gyms, its own cafeteria. So it could have been, the new high school, or if there were talks about a middle school, it could have been the new middle school, those sort of things. The one thing that actually Dr. Newell addressed in the last board meeting is that while we still had a lot of ways to go in terms of determining whether we would even have a bond vote, we have taken off, even before COVID, some of those more expensive options, like the option of a standalone building. So standalone autonomous building, that is not on the board. Second thing is, again, we have not committed to anything even from a bond perspective for next year. What we have done, because we do still think we have needs, and I'll talk to that in a second, but what we have done, nothing commits us to doing anything, but what we have done is made sure that there's certain precursors that have to go on before you can even present a bond proposal to the community. Some they have to do with like environmental studies of what the impact of different scenarios would be, different kinds of analysis. So we have done or continuing to do those things to at least allow for the possibility of putting forward a bond to the community. But again, that doesn't commit us to do anything. And even if we were to say we're going to do, a bond or ask for a bond, it doesn't commit us to any dollar amount. That could be $1 million bond. It could be whatever. But again, the final line is anything we were to do in that area would be in the context of what the current financial environment is, versus what do we think our actual needs are, and it would have to be voted on by the community in a standalone vote. So there's nothing, the board can't just say, up, we're building a building, here's what it's costing you to do it. So there would be a whole series of meetings like this where we've talked to the community, where we would explain why we're asking for what we're asking for if we do go that route. I would say that we've done a lot of analysis on student growth, and it is always still, somewhat of an art more than a science, but we've looked at that question from a lot of different angles using a lot of different sort of ways of modeling, and they all still point to increased enrollment in Edgemont. They may come up with different levels of numbers and how fast it goes up, and nothing says that if it holds flat next year, it can't suddenly jump up the following year. I can tell you just anecdotally, on my little cul-de-sac, which doesn't have that many houses, in the last month, 3 houses have turned over, adding 7 kids to the district. So, I think prices are down right now relative to what they have been. And I think some people are looking at this as a good opportunity to come into a school district like this at a lower price than, they may have, much lower price than they maybe even 6 months ago it was going to cost them. That's anecdotal evidence. That's not something you would, that alone that you would base a bond offering on. But at any rate, we do think there's going to be expansion, but before anything happens, there'll be many series of conversations and presentations and talks with the community about what it is that we would be asking for if and when we ask for it.
Got it. Thanks, Alex. So it sounds like this budget is completely separate with anything related to the bond and an expansion. And when it comes time to initiate those conversations again, likely in later summer and to the fall as it relates to the bond, there'll be a variety of public forums by which community members can engage in that dialogue.
Absolutely.
So we've covered all the questions that have come in. There was a few that, prior to the call starting, there's a few that came in while we were talking. So 2 in particular that I thought we can address. One is how will we handle the shortfalls from potential cuts in state aid, which I know you talked about a little bit, but any increases in certiorari's as well as decrease in sales tax revenue that we may see in the community.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in on that, Alec, if you'd like. I think that so decreases in state aid will have to be addressed by either additional cuts during the school year of expenses that have not been encumbered yet, or by additional drawdown of existing reserves. So those are kind of the 2 places that we would look to address any shortfall that we're seeing from state aid. The state aid kind of dollar figure based on what at risk, that based on what we've heard from Albany, could be anywhere up to $800,000, and I think based on this budget, we feel comfortable that we can find that additional money without having to make any substantial cuts. Again, we'd have to. That would be different if we were in the contingency budget. In terms of certiorari's, the good news about certiorari's is we do have a reserve fund for certiorari's, and so we pay certiorari's out of that reserve fund. Again, this is part of what Sue has done to make sure that we don't have unexpected spikes in our tax levy. And then in terms of the third part of the question was in terms of the sales revenue. The sales revenue expectations in the budget are conservative, and we had a change in sales revenue calculations last year that worked in our favor, and so while it looks like it's up significantly, that's due to some of those changes, and we feel comfortable are actually the ones that are in the budget are actually fairly conservative.
Right. If I could just add one little piece to the certiorari portion of that, as Marquita pointed out, we have a reserve for that. We add for that. When Sue came in 2005, believe it or not, Edgemont actually had no reserves for anything. So she has done a phenomenal job of building up a number of these reserves, so we have them, the ability to draw down on them in situations like that. But in terms of the actual certiorari's, and just if I can digress for 30 seconds, because not everybody understands what certiorari's are, and sometimes they think it also that it's, if you grieve your house's value, that actually is not a certiorari. And basically, if that happens, it only affects going forward. So if your house is valued at $1 million and you think it's worth 800,000, and you go in and then you are successful with that grievance, the difference there basically gets spread across all of the rest of Edgemont, so it doesn't affect our school revenues at all. The certiorari's are the commercial properties, like the shopping mall where ShopRite is and things like that. There, it's a very complicated, I won't get into that at all, formula as to how they determine what those values are. The problem with those is that it can take, in some cases, several years to work it out. And the problem is, it's unlike with the residential property where it just changes their taxes going forward. They actually can, if they started this year and it takes 3 years to go, they can actually have to get refunds for those prior 3 years if they're successful. But so the numbers you see specifically in the budget are just the dollars that we're adding to the reserve for this year. But as Marquita said, we have, I think, $4.5 million in that reserve right now. So we feel pretty comfortable that we're in a pretty good place for those. And as I said, because of the way the timing on the certiorari's work, any effect that comes out of what's going on now, we probably won't see for 4 or 5 years.
One more question that came in was, could we share the link to the law in which the state requirements for out-of-district transportation?
Yeah, so I will say thank you to my colleagues on the board who pulled this up, but it's actually the educational law 30, it's statute like section 3635 if you want to look it up, but we can certainly put that link on the budget page where the transportation costs are represented. I did, just in line with those transportation costs, I did want to include that in those transportation costs are also transportation for special education students who have to go out of district for placements as well. So that's also in that cost. It does not include any transportation costs associated with field trips or athletics. All those are in other line items with respect to where they are incurred.
Thanks. So that really wraps up all the questions that we received in advance and that we received on the call. I just personally wanted to give a shout out both to Marquita and Alex in the depth of knowledge that you guys have, the entire board for that matter. I know everyone's volunteers, parents, right, had kids in the district, and are really doing this all on a volunteer basis. So so thank you for really extending your time, right, and really digging deep into the budgets. I think when I was asked to help moderate this call, you guys said this was the first time ever really we've had a town hall like this, as it relates to the budget. So it's an unusual meeting. Clearly, we had some of our own technology issues, which I experience on a day-to-day basis. Just in my full-time job as technology is overloaded. So thanks to the community for bearing with the patients. I'm glad we had a really nice turnout, and I'm glad everybody stayed later than they probably thought. So it's glad to have it's nice to see community involvement. But these are unprecedented times. You know, communication, transparency is important. I know Alec and Margarita and any of the other board members are available to the community, one-on-one if there's any specific questions that we weren't able to cover and that you would like to cover, post conversation. I believe this, even though the live streaming didn't work, I think we may have been able to record this, and if so, we could put that recording, on the site. So those who want to, revisit some of these portions or tell friends who may want to hear, or listen into some pieces will be able to. So with that said, unless there's anything else or, esteemed board members wanted to add to the, to the dialogue, I would just, give out a great thanks and conclude the call.
Thank you, Nancy.
Thanks.
Yes, thank you very much for doing that. Again, I just want to reiterate, if you have questions, we're always available, either individually or just emailing the BOE at edgemont.org email address. We try to answer questions as quickly as we can. Sometimes if we think they're more complicated answers than an email, we'll actually, try and set up a phone call where we can sit down and go in more depth to explain these things. We appreciate the interest. We appreciate the questions. I mean, we want informed voters. So this is how people get informed. So we appreciate that you took the time to ask the questions and, as you said, to dial in and to listen to what we had to say. So we are not allowed to advocate one way or another in the vote, but we can always advocate that you do vote. We please ask that you take the information that you've got and make your decision and cast your ballot. So thank you all.
Thank you. Have a good night.
All right.
Good night.
Thank you.